Is the reason people don't read Baudelaire because people don't read any poetry in translation except for some haiku and then ancient Greek and Roman poets?
I mean, again, that's a little bit of a like, is the reason that there was nothing objectionable in Barbie because Barbie's fun? It was like, well, all right, so hold on a minute.
No,
Like,
no, I'm trying to
hey,
think. I'm
like
trying to think. No, because
way, way, way more people read Baudelaire than read like almost any other. Like, if the
is that
number of
true?
poets
Like
that
in
are
your
read
do
more than
people
Baudelaire is very small.
no, but I'm asking, is that true? Like in of American poetry reading poet people, like of the listeners to this, do you think most all right, I like this. No, here we go. What percentage of SLEERICKETS listeners
Uh-huh.
has read it's what percentage of listeners have read, that's the way that grammar works.
I don't
What
know.
percentage of SLEERICKETS listeners, SLEERICKETS is plural, so this becomes singular, is that of what percentage of SLEERICKETS listeners have read a poem in English, translated into English by Baudelaire in the last year?
Huh. Okay. Um,
Because you say what
yeah,
percentage of SLEERICKETS listeners have read a poem in the last year? You'd probably say close to 100%.
by virtue of listening to the podcast, even if you're not at all a poetry person, if you listen to this podcast semi
Probably
regularly,
you're
chances are
around a
you've read a
poem or
poem.
you've read a poem.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
and
yeah,
then
yeah.
I'd say what percentage of SLEERICKETS listeners have read something by Shakespeare in the last year? Something. So a
Right. I mean, but
sonnet
but like
or
I've also talked about a number of things by Shakespeare, which colors that slightly,
okay, sure, great.
right? Like
So
I
I would
like I
say
definitely
I would
definitely talk
say
about Shakespeare more than I talk about Baudelaire. Like I think
right.
there are two ways to answer
But
this.
hang
Like
on, hang on, hang on.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I
Okay.
don't. So, what percentage have read something of about written by Shakespeare in the last year? 60%, 80%.
I'd say 60 to 80.
Okay, so you just took my two numbers and said both.
Yeah, I think yeah,
Okay, okay, okay,
somewhere in
okay, okay.
there. Yeah.
All right, cool. Um, and then what percentage have read a poem by a contemporary American poet you've mentioned on the show? So Stallings or Wilson
Yeah, 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 yeah.
or anybody else, higher or lower than the Shakespeare number?
Probably at the high end or higher. Yeah. So like closer to just 80 or like 80 to 90, I think probably.
Okay.
Like I think there probably are people who yeah, I think that's not the way it should go, but I suspect that may be the way it actually goes.
And then where do you put a translated poem by Baudelaire? What percentage
Of SLEERIKETS listeners who've read a translated poem by Baudelaire
in the last year?
um, in the last year, let's say 40%.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
And the key here's the key.
No.
Yeah. Oh
I
yeah.
thought you were going to say 8%,
No, I think 40%.
9%.
Of SLEERIKETS listeners, I think
Yeah,
probably 40% have read
of
a
main
poem
show,
by
not secret
Baudelaire.
show, of main show, main feed SLEERIKETS listeners. 2 out of 5?
I've read a poem by Baudelaire
A
in the last
complete
year.
poem in translation by Baudelaire in the last
Oh fuck, maybe
365
not.
days?
Maybe not. Maybe it's more
Two
like
out of five?
20. Maybe it's more like 20. Because like the like the distortion I'm getting is like when you compare Shakespeare to any contemporary American poet, right? It's like if you were to pick like any one
Oh,
contemporary
of
American poet,
course, of
like that
course,
changes radically. But like
of course.
yeah, I mean I guess my assumption is higher, but then I also don't actually know who listens to this show. Like as Cameron said, like maybe it's all middle-aged Catholic men, in which case the percentage is actually like 80% have read Baudelaire in the last year. That's the thing is like Baudelaire is like a poet of like laudanum and the gutter and prostitutes and like violent sex jokes, but like his biggest readership is like conservative Christians in
Is that
America.
true? I read a shitload of Baudelaire when I was studying French literature in college, and I thought Baudelaire was fucking
When you were what?
studying French literature as an undergrad.
Okay, yeah, yeah,
And I fucking loved Baudelaire. I thought
yeah,
Baudelaire was great. And I have not thought about Baudelaire in 20 years. For a 4-year period of time, I
yeah.
spent like fucking hours and hours and hours reading Baudelaire. And I
You were like you like was it French major minor? Was
yeah,
that
it was like one of my things. So like yeah, I spent a
yeah?
lot of time. But my bigger point is that I
You
have
like
not
lived in
come
France and
across,
you, yeah.
I have not heard anybody say Baudelaire other than you in 10 years.
No, like if you've listened to the podcast, you have, because
I said other than you. Oh, sure. Other than you and
or other
talking
people on the
to you.
podcast. Yeah.
Right. And I am a man of letters. I can't,
But like there was like a Baudelaire controversy in the formal poetry world in the last year.
okay.
So
I didn't know that. What was the controversy?
Was Aaron Pachigian's translation good? Was it sloppy? Was Angie Mlenko's
Okay.
review mean, or was his
Okay.
response to her mean? Or yeah.
Well, then we're showing is my ignorance.
But like if you were to like grab a bunch of individual poet names, Baudelaire is still going to be like way better read than most poets living or dead.
More listeners of yours have read a poem by A.E. Stallings or Baudelaire.
A. Stallings, I think, probably.
Interesting.
In the among the Americans, among those outside of the US and like UK at this point, because she's the Oxford professor of poetry, but like among, say, the Australians, she and Baudelaire might be more neck and neck.
A. Stallings, Baudelaire, or Amanda Gorman?
Oh, I think almost everybody will have at least like heard / read / been confronted with Amanda Gorman.
The inauguration poem, at least.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, I think we've solved free will.
Yeah. You have no choice but to read Amanda Gorman.
Yeah.
You have
whether you have read Baudelaire,
choice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is a product of neurotransmitters plus who is your babysitter.
I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. Thank you all for listening. Thanks especially to those of you who have taken a moment sometime this week to recommend the show to a friend. That is the primary way that word gets around about the podcast. So just, if there's somebody in your life you think would enjoy listening or hate listening to the conversations we have on this podcast, please recommend the show to him, her, them, or otherwise. Thanks also to everybody who subscribes to The Secret Show. If you would like to get more SLEERICKETS or more slightly unguarded SLEERICKETS, go to sleerickets.substack.com and put in your email address, and we'll give you a week's access for free so you can see what it is all about. We have some 70-odd episodes up there now. You'll have access to the whole backlog and a new episode every week. Often it is the second half or the more ill-advised half of one of the conversations we've had on here, but there are also a lot of solo episodes and other conversations on there as well. All right, so this week's episode is this is definitely an intractable problems episode. The original tagline of the show was a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. This is an intractable problem. I guess one of the more intractable problems. There have been lately a lot of conversations about free will, debating whether or not it exists. We will not be doing that here. You can go to plenty of other places if that's what you're looking for. Instead, being the insufferable nerds, and I think it was Andrew Palmer who called us lit bros, literary bros, Brian and I are going to be talking about free will. That is, we sort of come to the conclusion that everybody's talking about it wrong. In case, though, I know Brian has already demonstrated irrefutably that there is no difference between genders, and men and women are interested in and care about and respond to all things in exactly the same ways. But in a theoretical world in which, roughly half of the population cares slightly more about one set of things than another set of things, if you are not so into the philosophical, evolutionarily biological angle, then just know that we will also be talking about our marriages and child rearing and all of that sort of nonsense as well. We also talk about a really great short Ted Chiang story. So I think all of that it is pretty fun. And there is it's not exactly a second half. I'll probably just give it a different title, but there's some more slightly farther afield stuff that we'll get into on The Secret Show. For now, though, here's my conversation with Brian about about free will, aboutness. What we talk about when we talk about talking about free will.
So we're talking about free will, and
Yeah.
I
I
don't
made you
care
read like
about free will.
5 things,
Yeah, and I liked all the things I read. I
except for
was
the what, except for like the serious research paper report, which was nigh unreadable.
yeah, and I think dismissible because I don't think it matters. But I
I
have
said it because I think it lines up. It was what I thought of when I read the Ted Chiang story.
totally, and I want to talk about the Ted Chiang story. Ted Chiang just wrote a story by Borges, right? Like this is just what he's just doing Borges here.
What he's really doing is he's doing like Richard Matheson by way of Borges.
Yeah, okay. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll give you that. That works. So we have four um written artifacts that we're discussing, all of which are hovering around the concept of free will and whether it exists or not. And all of them pretty much say, prove, assert that free will does not exist.
Yes.
And they do so in very different ways. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think, yeah, they all assert that and they get there from different angles. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So you came to me with this because of a philosopher named Robert Sapolsky who just
Is he a philosopher?
published.
I thought he was like an evolutionary biologist or something.
Yeah. Oh, okay. But
Or I don't
this
know.
seems like a work
Like,
of philosophy. But yes, I
sure. Yeah.
agree. He really, really, really does not think there's such thing as free will. And I don't know whether in this capacity he's an evolutionary biologist or a
Right. Right.
philosopher,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
but he wrote this book called Determined, and in it he argues that everything that happens because something previously happened. And the
Yes.
thing that happened could not be otherwise.
It is a bizarrely elementary argument against free will. Like the
That
argument is like purely like, aha, but what caused that?
exactly.
That's it. Like
That's
that's
what I
the
was gonna
whole thing.
say. That's
Right.
what I was gonna say. It's not, it's
It's shockingly unsophisticated.
right. And I don't know, is there a power in that lack of sophistication? Because to me, it felt just like tautological and boring. But maybe I missed something. And that was where I wanted to start with you. So his argument, and let me lay it out, is essentially that there are two components that lead to every decision. The component of biology and genes, and sort of, he doesn't differentiate so much among these, but that we would say the phrase for that would be nature, right? That there's the component that you are born with, and that makes you make certain decisions. And
Yeah.
then he talks about everything that precedes you,
Right. That
which
led
I
to your
think
nature.
led to, which I think we would call nurture plus, maybe, because it's like it implies that it's not only how you are nurtured, but how the people who nurtured you were nurtured, and the people who nurtured the people who nurtured you. And it's not just how you were nurtured, but it's if a bus happens to cross your path, and if your
Right. And
next
like
door neighbor's stove
prenatal
happens to
conditions, which can
explode.
be like adjacent to genetics without being genetics.
But pre and postnatal, I think that
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. But like
that's
at
what he's
every
sort of
stage that these,
exactly. So
yeah.
he's like, if you take A, which is all of your cellular construction leading up to your physical form, and you put it into the context of B, which is all the stuff that happened before you were born, and then all the stuff that you experience, it will inevitably lead to C, which is the thing that happens. And then any counterpoint to that, he doesn't say it explicitly, but he says implicitly, any counterpoint to that, like, but what if this happened instead? He says, yes, if this happened instead, that's just a manifestation of all of these, of A and B. So if you say, I was going to go to the circus, but last minute I chose to go to the baseball game, he would say,
Right.
you didn't choose to do
Yeah.
anything. You were at a point where in your life where inevitably you were going to choose to go to the circus. And then
Right.
inevitably after that, you would choose to go to the baseball game.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
that's
like
that seems to be his argument.
and then I just had to like there seemed to be no recognition of the comedy in this moment, but he makes this whole big case. One of the things I sent you was an interview. He makes this whole big case, and then Sean Illing, the interviewer, says like, "Okay, so just to really clarify this, to really hit this home, what you're saying is that if we rewound the tape and we went back to those same initial conditions, it would come out exactly the same way every time." And he says, "Yes, except it wouldn't because of quantum randomness. But anyway, moving on. Yes, everything's perfectly determined." You think, well, hold on.
Right. But he actually, I mean, what he does say to that, I think if he were here, what he would
Yeah.
say
He
is
would
that
say, yeah,
he would
randomness
say
is not
he,
choice.
he would say randomness is built in. So he would say, yes, everything would come to the same circumstance because the random things that happened previously would lead us to the same place. If not, the randomness would maybe end up somewhere else and inevitably lead to a slightly different place.
Randomness is another element of the causal
Entry
chain.
point.
It's
Exactly.
just an
Exactly.
inconsistent one.
Exactly. But I don't think he's interested in consistencies. I think that is a degree more sophisticated than what he's getting to. I think what he's interested in is saying, look, the stuff that happens led to the stuff that happened. And if you change the stuff that happens, whether the reason it was changed is because of randomness on a molecular level, or somebody went back in time to shoot the butterfly or step on the butterfly or whatever the story is, or anything else, like that would lead inevitably to this. And I just don't know what the
Yeah.
utility of this is. Like, what is his point? Like, yes, he has an airtight argument because nothing can happen except for what happens.
Right.
So if you say, but sir, I can choose now to take a breath or bang the table or get out of the shower or whatever it
Yeah.
is, he would say, you think you can, but really whatever happens was preordained by what happens previously. And then where do you end up? Like, I just don't,
Right.
I don't really understand why he's so excited by these, like, I don't know. I go back to tautological because that's sort of the language
Yeah.
analogy here, but inevitablist rhetoric, because it's sophistry to me. I think I don't understand the utility to this.
Yeah. So what fascinated me was that I suddenly started hearing interviews with him everywhere. And he does seem to be a universally respected, like brilliant
Totally.
man of science. And what sort of shocked me was that everything I heard him saying, and it's not even that I disagree with him, it's just that everything I heard him saying seemed to be extremely familiar, very basic observations about the free will question that like one encounters in high school or college. And yet it seemed to be like it was treated like some sort of breakthrough. And I kept thinking, like, how could this possibly be a whole book? Like, how can
And
this? How?
right. And maybe the answer is that we are ready for it again in the cycle. That
Yeah.
maybe right now, and again, this is more sort of dumb theorizing, the likes of which I would dismiss if it came from somebody other than me or you or Alice. But I just, maybe it's because at this moment when we all hate Trump so much, Sean Illing saying, is there ever an intellectually coherent reason to hate another human being? And him just flat out, after, going on and on and on in these other answers, just him saying no. And then
Yeah.
Sean Illing saying under no circumstances. And then
Right.
Professor Sapolsky says not in the slightest, under no circumstances, because if you really, really follow the logic of this out, hating someone makes as little sense as hating an earthquake or hating the coronavirus.
Yeah.
My guess
The
is
least
that
compelling part of his argument. But yeah, go on.
totally. But my guess is that is at the core of why this is of interest to so many people now, because it lets you take an entirely, maybe passive's not the right word, but entirely, it gives you permission not to hate. It gives you permission not to get involved with fury and anger and indignation, and you don't need to hate the Israelis, nor do you need to hate the Hamas. You don't need to hate Trump, nor do you need to hate Kamala Harris. It's just like, this is what it is. We'll deal with it. It will be what it will be.
Yeah.
and you're allowed to take a deep breath. My guess is that is why this is of interest now, because otherwise I don't understand. I don't understand. Even he admits he's felt this way since he was 16 years old. I was an adolescent when I decided there's no free will. Yeah, Professor Sapolsky, we all were, right? Like that's not unique to you. Like this idea that we're not in control of our actions strikes me as a inherently adolescent thought, and then from there you build up a, a stable of meaning. From there you become an existentialist who says we're going to create our own meaning. But the pre-existentialist thought is the 16-year-old's thought, which is that there is no meaning, and then from that you build meaning. He doesn't seem interested in that, and that's what's so odd to me, that like, yeah, the thing you're saying we all know, but the project of our life is to figure out what matters to us and devote ourselves to that, or to think about that. And whether it's poetry or love or politics or betterment or something, like, fine. He feels like he's closing his eyes and covering his ears and saying la 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 la, none of this matters, because it was all going to happen anyway. And it doesn't seem sophisticated. It seems crude and elementary, but maybe I'm missing something.
No, it does. And I think the other part that to me leapt out as being of importance to him, and maybe like another part of the current, like what makes this current, is the class questions and the criminal justice questions. So like he ends the little excerpt in the Harvard Gazette by talking about an imaginary graduation ceremony. He does take, like, as a weird target, the like working class families, or like this is their
Very
first,
strange.
like, oh, the first person in your family to graduate from college. You feel so proud of them, don't you?
I know.
Really, you'd like randomly pick any of the graduates, do some magic so that this there's a garbage collector who's picking up trash next to the ceremony.
And presumably the garbage collector is the same age as the graduates, which is definitely not the case at Harvard. Like, this scenario is just so weird, because, sorry, read it, but the conclusion to this, me ruining his story, therefore your story, is that you get to the end, and if the garbage collector had the childhood of the Harvard graduate,
he
and the
would
Harvard
now
graduate,
be a 55-year-old college graduate.
Right. Like, why are you comparing the 22-year-old Harvard grad to this guy who's collecting garbage also, is garbage collected at the ceremony?
This is like the line about Tom Cruise going to the ravioli store. Like, this is somebody who has no understanding of how garbage collection works.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean,
he's imagining this, like, also getting a job like where you collect garbage at Harvard. It's not a good job, but it's also not a bad job. Like, it's right. It's like the worst thing he can imagine is like this job where you get to, work a 9 to 5 in these beautiful buildings collecting garbage off it's like, it's not like they are the kidnapped sex worker that is forced into submission by the graduate's father as a party favor for his kid upon graduation. Like he can't imagine the actual hideousness.
No. I mean, and my thought was like, oh, like you could just do this whole scenario, but it just takes place in Iran, and then 30 years later, the college graduate is collecting garbage at Harvard because they don't recognize his degree in this country.
Exactly. It's there's something he's so happy with himself in this analogy, and it's like, I don't know. Also, the garbage collector could be totally cool with it. Like, if he goes home and he's got like a family who loves him, he's probably gonna have a pension. Like he's doing all right. There's just not the destitute obviousness that he implies. And I know a lot of Harvard graduates who are fucking miserable. And I just don't, I don't know what his point is.
Well, and he does say we congratulate the graduate on all she's accomplished and move out of the way of the garbage guy without glancing at him. He's turned him into a garbage guy. But like, I think like the well-intentioned part of this seems to be like, hey, have you ever wondered how sometimes we give people credit for things that maybe they were actually born on third base? And like, sure, yeah, that seems very true. But also, like, just as with there's no reason to hate anybody, but where none of us has free will, Like there's no reason for us to admire the college grad or I mean, also like first generation college grad still just feels like a weird target to me. Like, how about like, I don't know, like I have a good friend who like worked very hard and is brilliant and made it from like a working class family to run a hedge fund. And like, and like, but like, how about the guy who didn't go through what he went through and runs a hedge fund? Like, there's so many other interesting targets that like picking the first generation college grad feels very weird to me. But like, it does feel a
Yeah.
little bit like very, very first level, like soft liberal, like, hey, maybe you didn't build that kind of observation. And and it also seems to completely overlook like, well, if none of us, like if everything is caused and none of us is free and we're all driven by compulsion, and he even says like only 1% of the time can I make my emotions like line up with my rational observations about this, then like, well, what, like, is it possible that our hatred and our admiration are also just part of that causal chain, and we don't like isn't hating someone not really a rational conclusion but an emotional response anyway?
Right. Right. That's not an exception to everything he's saying. It's just one of
No,
the things. But he pulls it out
just
as an
like our
exception. Okay.
admiration of people like,
Okay.
yeah.
So I totally agree. So let's take a step back and ask each other, I think, the more interesting question, which is, what is the second order conclusion to take from this? Like what, like
Yes.
when you, because like I was my I live in American standards, an old house. It was built in 1896. So it's like drafty. And in the cold, like in the winter, it's gets cold. And even if the sort of old crappy heating system's on, some of the rooms get very hot and some of them gets very cold. And my bathroom is one of the rooms with a bad heater.
Mhm.
So when I'm in the shower, it's very warm and nice in the shower, and it's
The
very
second you get
cold
out, it's yeah.
cold and unpleasant to get out of the shower. So I starting in December, January, February, I spend far more time in the shower than I rationally want to. And even when I'm in the shower, I know that I no longer want to be in the shower. I have things to do. It's dehydrating my skin. Like I'm clean. Like I don't need to be here anymore. But I know that I don't want to transition from the shower to no longer in the shower because
Right.
it's physically unpleasant. And there is a period of time from 10 seconds to 10 minutes where I am having this non-conversation with myself. And then I am out of the shower.
Right.
And whether I am deciding to get out of the shower or not in a moment is confusing to me. And I am not certain about the moment of decision making. I think I decide to get out of the shower, but I'm still in the shower. And then all of a sudden I'm out of the shower without really having made the decision to get out of the shower. Of course I made the decision and I turned off the water, but there's a fluidity, forgive the pun, to that state, which is really complicated, I
Mhm.
think. And like, it's a similar students, 13-year-olds are fascinated by this more than adults are. But if you put your hands on the table and you tell yourself to pick your hand off the table,
Yeah.
you can tell yourself to pick your hand off the table, but that's not the same as actually lifting your hand off the table. And there's something
Sure.
odd that happens in your brain
Yeah.
between deciding to lift your hand off the table and lifting your hand off the table. And that is a microcosm of this larger discussion of like, when are we deciding? When are we
Right.
doing? What is the relationship between deciding and doing? And and where is sort of consciousness and the soul and all of that coming
Yeah.
into
Yeah. Yeah.
play
Yeah.
versus animal instinct? And I think that is worth discussing.
Yeah.
I don't quite have the vocabulary for it, but I think that that is a conversation that at least I'm interested in engaging in more so than everything is inevitable. Prove it. You can't prove it. Fine. You prove it. No, I can't either. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thing.
And to be fair again to Robert Sapolsky, like if the conclusion is like we should be less punitive and more like concerned with just public safety when we deal with criminal justice, and we should be more understanding of like and like forgiving and generous toward like class differences, then like I'm totally with him on all that. It just feels like he's like a he's like a guy who just like burst from his freshman dorm room with this
Yeah.
great revelation for everybody that you're
No,
like,
I think I
all right, yeah,
agree with nearly
yeah,
all his conclusions. We should be more generous to one another
yeah, yeah, yeah,
because
of course.
no one, but like But isn't that just the same thing as like the memes or the tropes or the, you know, Instagram posts where like I've seen it, it's like there's like a long line and the last 5% is highlighted and it's like what we see about someone, you know, and then
Sure,
like
yeah. The
98% is
iceberg,
like
yeah, yeah.
what happened in their day, you know, like what we don't see about them, you know, because
Yeah.
like yeah,
Or
we
like
should
the
go,
David
we should
Foster Wallace essay. Like, yeah,
exactly.
like
We
this
are
is like a
the
million
water,
commencement
right?
speeches. That's
Exactly.
the thing. That's what he's actually revealing in that whole graduation ceremony shtick
I
is
know
it's a
it.
commencement speech, is what he's giving.
Right. And
Um,
he couldn't, I mean that's what we used to call and what, you know, Wolf, which we'll talk about Tom Wolf later, but what he would despise us for calling a Freudian slip, right? Like his mind is on commencement speeches because all he has is a commencement speech to
oh
give in this
man,
nonsense.
how disappointing will it be if nobody asks him to give a commencement speech after this round of like,
Uh
yeah, yeah.
it'll well for him it won't be disappointing at all because he'll know that it was just the inevitable conclusion of a series of events that took place and that nobody, you know, it was never in the
It was
cards.
never in the cards. Sorry, Robert. Yeah, I mean, so you're talking a little bit about this question, and there is, I'll say, like there's a different like social level question that I have about all this, but yeah, so what you're talking about is this like the questions that arise from a very contained set of observations that are explored both in the Ted Chiang story and in this much discussed experiment performed in 1983 by Benjamin Libet or Libet
Yeah.
that was apparently like the conclusions were mistaken for a number of reasons, but the basic observation is sort of like useful, and it's what Ted Chiang is working from. So the Libet experiment basically was exactly what you're talking about, where you choose to press a button or not to press it, or you choose when you press it, and the conclusions, which again were scientifically unsound at the time, but basically seem to be probably in some sense correct globally, are that before you have the conscious thought that you want to press the button, your brain does something that says
Right.
like press the button.
You physically, neurologically, something, your body, brain, whatever you want to
Knows
call
before
the
you do.
thing, begins to do the thing
Yeah,
before you decide to do it.
right. Which suggests that the conscious decision to do it is almost like a post hoc explanation. Like, oh, the reason I'm like, which we have found with lots of other like, you know, brain surgery patients is like we are very good at very quickly coming up with explanations that we will believe for why we are doing something when we don't know why we're doing something. And so the suggestion is that maybe all conscious choice is actually that, and that it's just happening at a lower level, and our conscious choices are just sort of an epiphenomenon of our actions, which were already in the works anyway.
Right. I am happy to count myself in the simplistic cynic's perspective as one of the simplistic cynic who believes that the science is wrong, who believes this is just is a bug, not a feature. And the thing that we think we're able to measure, or the thing that we're able to measure, happens more quickly than the thing that we think we're doing. So I am happy to count myself as one of the ignoramuses who think that this is a bug in the system and our body in some way is always primed to press the button and you just can't measure decision making as fast as you can measure synaptic neuron, so we're getting the neurosynapses before we're getting the decision. Like I just don't, it
Yeah.
strikes me as wrong is
Yeah.
what I'm
So
saying. I
yeah, you're right in the sense that in the Libet experiment, what was I sent you this unreadable scientific paper about the Libet experiment, and
Yeah.
basically the conclusion was it didn't prove what he thought it proved. What it proved was that as you're getting ready to do something,
Right.
there's a certain buildup of
There's a
potential
ramp up.
energy,
Right.
but it actually turns out, based on later experiments, that that is still redirectable up until the moment when you actually choose to do it. And so
Exactly.
it's not,
Exactly.
in fact, it doesn't demonstrate what it thinks it demonstrates.
So the
We're not,
unreadable
yeah,
argument that you sent me doesn't use this language, but I think what it made me think of is like potential versus kinetic energy, and like what Lebet was measuring was uh potential energy, thinking it was kinetic energy, and the kinetic energy just starts when you as your consciousness, you know, even though we can't prove that exists, actually puts the decision making into play. But go ahead.
yeah. So when I heard about the Levitt experiment, and I mistakenly remembered reading about it in the Tom Wolfe essay, which in fact he does not write about. I didn't hear the debunking of it, but I kind of had like I had a like basically my thought was like, okay, so there's sort of three possibilities. One is that like the science is wrong. Like you did your math, you something in the experiment is wrong and it doesn't actually work. And that turns out to be the actual answer. Although different versions of the Levitt experiment may may suggest conclusions closer to some of the original conclusions. Another possibility is that it's right. And like we just like the things that happen, the things we do are just like in the works beforehand and our conscious choices are epiphenomena. There's another possibility that came to mind, which is that it's true for this sort of thing. Like whether or not you choose to press this button on a table in a test is sort of like whether or not in the moment you choose this or that ice cream flavor you like equally. That it's sort of like it's such a non-consequential, like we are not really bothered by the idea that we have limited free will when it comes to whim, right?
Yeah.
Let's go with the red one. Or like that to us, like that doesn't feel like an important exercise of our free will.
Yep.
Whereas like, should I marry this woman? Like does feel like an important exercise of our free will. And we can kind of, it's easy for us to believe that we might be like even like causally swayed by environmental factors when it comes to like, let's go with the wingtip, like that just seems like, sure, of course something swayed me because I saw something in that moment, or like because I had to go to the bathroom and I wanted to get out of the store. Like that feels like that doesn't seem to challenge our sense of ourselves. And so like the thought I had at the time was like, well, probably this is that level of decision. And so like maybe that is sort of just like causal clockwork. And it just because basically like our higher level thinking is referring this to like is like farming this out to like a lower level nerve function.
I agree with everything you said except for the marry this woman part, which I think I am the most convinced that the marry this woman part is inevitable and not free
Yeah.
will related
Right.
compared to like when I am standing in front of at a bakery counter and I'm
Yeah.
deciding whether to get the plain croissant or the chocolate croissant or something like that.
Yeah.
Like I believe I have free will in that moment. I believe I could go in either direction
Yeah.
and I can decide. And yes, you can tick back every second of my life and it will end up inevitably with the one I decide because that's the way seconds work. But that doesn't interest me. Whereas I spent my life around lots and lots and lots of different people, and a total of one of those people did I really feel myself wanting to be connected to in the way I wanted to be connected to Alex. And none of that is rational.
You
Like
can't
that,
you can't imagine your life taking a slightly different turn and you just marrying somebody else.
sure, but that is if I hadn't met Alex or if I fought with her the first time I saw her, or if she was dating somebody else, and then I wouldn't have married Alex, I would have stumbled into something else. I would have married the other person. But my decision to be attracted to Alex wasn't really a decision. My decision to get along with her wasn't really a decision. My decision, these things didn't have free will involved. Like they had the least amount of free will. That really was like the
Right.
right time, the right place, and
Yeah,
like
yeah.
and like pheromones or something,
Yeah.
and like I am willing to believe that that is not some inevitability, but
Yeah.
that is the least free will of all of these other things. Where like if I'm like Milky Way or Snickers, I don't. Well, I
Mm.
guess peanuts. I might right. I don't. I'm making a choice and I'm choosing the Milky Way. Like that.
Right.
That feels like a choice. Like, but the billions and billions, trillions of inputs that led to my being in the same place as Alex, my liking her, my being attracted to her, my liking the taste of her kiss, my, get like all of that feels very outside of my control in a way that isn't necessarily a conversation regarding free will, but because you use that as the counterpoint, I just wanted to
Yeah.
say I do not feel that as an outlier. I feel that is maybe the only useful explanation of a lack of free will.
Yeah, I mean, I agree in that I don't really think we have free will in any of the cases. And I am also with you in feeling like the overall progression of my life seems like a set of circumstances in which I can identify almost none of my own self-directed like
Right.
it's
Right.
part of the reason like stories like Saltburn are kind of juicy and compelling to us, because like the idea of somebody actually willfully choosing the direction of his life and making things happen, even though that person is usually a psychopath, like is interesting
Totally.
because we feel ourselves just swept along by the currents.
And because I'm old and tired and about to die, the conversation that I always want to have based on all of this is about parenting, because like the inputs that will create the inevitability in our kids' lives come from us. And that is, and from school and from friends
Yeah,
and
yeah,
from
yeah, yeah.
neighborhoods and from everything else, but primarily, I think, from us. And the good professor, whose name I can't remember now, Sapolsky, would say, well, we're not making the decision to put those inputs into our kids. We're just doing the same thing that our parents, put us, and it's all
Yeah.
inevitable, et cetera. But it is not only worth contemplating, the constantly what I am contemplating, the things like, how am I going to mold, sculpt, create, manage, manifest my kid in such a way that they choose the Snickers bar as opposed to the Milky Way, or they marry the nice guy as opposed to the
Yeah.
hot guy, or like whatever it is. And I don't, whether it is inevitable that I will give my kids exactly this advice or exactly that hug, or scream at them as I did last night when all they wanted to do was cuddle because I was hungry and needed to have dinner. Like I don't know what the takeaway of any of it is, but that to me is what interests me far more than like, haha, you had to do this and haha, you had to do that too.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I am of the mind that like yes, the conditions that our kids are faced with right now are going to be the prompts that direct them in one way or another. And like yes, we could definitely make that worse. We could definitely like cause bad effects with choices we make, but I don't know that we can like consciously like when I think about like the Catholic school I went to, that like that I've had like a very large part of my personality in life is a response to this school that I really hated and that was
Yeah.
really oppressive. And like partly that's because of the nature of the school it was, but also like my siblings went to the same school
Yeah.
and they had the same parents, and like it just wasn't quite as like they hated it, but it just wasn't as big a deal. And I
Yeah.
think like so much of that is just like how I was programmed. Like I was the one who responded to it that way. Not everybody would have necessarily responded to it that way. So it wasn't like I think so much of what how our kids are going to turn out is cooked in from the beginning. And I think it may have. I mean, unfortunately, I think the bigger question is like which people will they happen to become friends with?
Yeah.
Like
It,
that's going to have a much bigger effect than like what parenting choice I make here, apart from making like obviously bad or negligent or abusive choices.
yeah, I think that you're right. And I fear that I've painted myself into some existential corner whereby so much of the meaning in my own life is wrapped up in my kids now. And
Is it
yeah.
like the meaning like for you personally, like your sense of like I, Brian Platzer, as a creature in the universe, the significance of my life is bound up in the course of my kids' lives?
Yeah, I wish that weren't the case, but I feel that it is. And not even long term, but day by day. Like
Hmm.
my bad days tend to be when my kids are sick or something bad happened at school, or one of them, did something wrong or is like feeling terrible, or I fear that I have become too wedded, emotionally wedded to my emotional state to theirs, or my anxieties to their outcomes.
But
And I
beyond even like when their lives like collide with yours, because like your kid being sick is definitely going to have a big effect on your day,
yeah.
whether or not you're emotionally bound up with them, just because like it's going to
Well,
reshape the course of the day.
that is a question that I don't know myself well enough to know the answer. So it's like when so the head of the lower school calls me, and I see her name on my cell phone, and my first reaction is like, fuck, fuck, my day is
Yeah,
fucked.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Fuck,
definitely. Yeah.
and then what happens is, as opposed to her telling me that my kid did something fucked up,
Yeah.
She told me that someone did something fucked up to my kid.
Oh God.
And I am massively relieved.
Okay. Yeah.
And I don't quite understand why. I mean, the explanation I think is that because for me, it's easier to parent a kid who has been wronged than a
Right.
kid
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
did the wrong thing. And that's my answer to your question. Like, is it because the effect it will have on my life is so substantial at the moment that I'm all wrapped up on it? Or is it some separate entity that I've like gambled on, right? That like I bet the house on Owen and Sam's success or something, and it better come in the money. I don't know. I think it's probably far more of the former. That like my day fucking sucks if my kid did
Yeah.
something bad and I need to like hear about it and then scold my kid and then like apologize to other parents and then like talk to them about how next time and how like it's like
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
just is
Yeah.
a terrible fucking day
Right. Well, like
where
in addition to the immediate consequences, there's then this additional problem to solve.
exactly.
Like
And
maybe
then,
there's like a black eye, but then there's all like if your kid has a black eye, that's all you need to worry about. But like
yeah, you
if
give him a
somebody's kid has
hug
a
and you,
black eye
right,
and your kid punched that kid, that's a
right,
standing problem.
right. And then there's the question like, fuck. And like, what happens if he's a sociopath? You know, like, what if,
Right.
like, then what if it's not only today I'm going to deal with this, it's the next fucking rest of my life. Like, I'm never
Yeah.
going to get out of this. So I don't know is the answer. I don't know whether I am so wedded to my kids' emotional reality because they have so much control over my minute to minute reality that I live in fear
Yeah.
of being vulnerable to their excesses, or whether it's something about my sense of self. Can we pause for a moment and
Yeah. Yeah.
just say that Thomas Wolfe fucking sucks?
Tom Wolfe.
Yes, sorry. Tom Wolfe
I mean,
is
Thomas Wolfe is a different question. I haven't read him, and I know
yeah.
he's very celebrated.
I read you can't come home again. You can come home again. I don't remember if you can or you can't, according to Thomas Wolfe. Uh, Tom Wolfe fucking sucks. Like like across the board. Like as much as you want him to be awful, he is awful. Like he's the one who wore the white suits, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What a fucking asshole. Why did he wear those white suits? And like, I, in my first novel, everybody was comparing it to Bonfire of the Vanities,
Oof,
like as
yeah.
though like that would be cool. So I
Right.
read Bonfire of the Vanities, and that book is fucking horrible. And like, then he writes this thing, and you read it, and you know immediately it's written by Tom Wolfe, and I
Yeah.
couldn't
Yeah.
quite
Yeah.
figure out why. So we'll get into what he says, which I actually unfortunately think have some like smart moments in it. But
Yeah.
it his
It's
writing
called "Sorry, But Your Soul Just Died," and it was published in 1996. Yeah.
and I can't even explain what he's talking about. Can you give like the thesis of this article?
Yeah, he learned about neural imaging,
And it made
and
him crazy,
he
right?
was like, this is what the next 100 years of human civilization are going to be all about.
Right. So he's
Is
like,
neural
stop
imaging."
everything,
Right.
neural imaging, right?
Yes.
Which is a bonkers premise because neural imaging sucks. It doesn't suck as bad as Tom Wolfe, but like it doesn't actually do anything. Like there's no the neural imaging has its value, but it
Yeah.
is vastly overstated in 2024, and it was so much more overstated in 1992 or whenever he wrote this.
Though it's one paragraph, and he kind of breezes past it because I think he thinks all neural imaging is magic. But the IQ cap,
Yeah.
like, it, is that real? Like,
I Googled it.
could that work?
I looked into it, and nobody today thinks that was real. I think at the time they thought it was real.
Okay. So the
So
IQ cap was literally a thing they could put on your head, and it would
right.
immediately tell you what your IQ was,
And the way that
which seems crazy.
Tom Wolfe handles this IQ cap is like, and
He
then
thinks
some
that's
really
all neural imaging is that.
right. He's like, neural imaging is so great, it's so smart. He's like, it costs $100 and takes all day to do full IQ tests. And these guys, they went into a lab and they found this hat that you can put on, and in 6 minutes for
It
$8,
measures the width of your skull, and
it
right.
gives you a better test, and it's even better. And you know what the problem is? No one wants to learn the truth. And it's
Right.
like, well, Mr. Wolfe, there are like 600 problems with the story you just told. Like, that's not like, and none of it is true. Like, none of it is valuable. There's no way that neural imaging could provide these different sorts of intelligence that IQ tests do. People are deeply skeptical of IQ tests from the beginning.
Yeah,
This neural imaging is just sort of a blunter version of that. It doesn't have any relevance to where IQ tests are actually implemented. Like, but, and he's like, and that's the problem with people. They don't want to know, just like they don't want to know that black people are dumber than white people, which he heavily implies, but doesn't
Yeah.
state, right? Is that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, like, it's like I read this in 2008 and found it very 2006 and found it very abrasive and obnoxious, but for different reasons then. And then I reread it this past week and found it really abrasive and obnoxious in whole new ways.
Yeah, it's super racist, but also people don't write like this anymore. Like
No.
he modifies every clause. Every sentence needs to have a proper noun. It's just like he is showing all his knowledge off. So he is mocking the people who dismiss research among primates, because basically
Yeah.
people researched primates and then said the reason black people commit crimes is because they have to. And he's surprised that people reacted against this. And
Yeah.
in the parenthetical where he's expressing his sarcastic surprise, he's like, this came as surprising news to NASA scientists who had first trained and sent a chimpanzee called Ham up on top of a Redstone rocket into suborbital spaceflight, and then trained and sent another one called Enos, which is Greek for man, up on an Atlas rocket and around the world in orbital spaceflight, and thereby accurately predicted the physiological, and an emotional sense of humans. And you're like, okay, that's actually a decent point. That there, in some science, you can use chimpanzee results to gauge human results. But instead, he needs to add the name of the scientists, what the name of the first rocket was, the type of first rocket, the type of second rocket, what the two chimpanzees were named, the fact that it went initially to suborbital space before going into orbital space, what the Greek meaning of the name of the second chimpanzee is, what the name of the second rocket is. It's like this sentence becomes unreadable because it's just Tom Wolfe including everything he knows in every
Just
single
like
sentence.
infinite color. Like he just wants all like the saturation on every clause to be turned up to 100.
And is something going on in 1993 where this is appealing? Like, I don't, did people read this and say, like, is this the new journalism? I thought that the new
Was
journalism was in like the 70s and 80s where people started using first person
Oh
entries
yeah, yeah. He
into.
was well established. He
So
was a
what is going on here?
fully
How is
formed
it?
Thomas Wolfe
So
when it
did
happened.
people read this and roll their eyes and say, what the fuck is wrong with this guy? Or was still in 1993 people were writing like this and it was acceptable?
I think it's 1996,
Well,
but
that makes it worse.
yeah, yeah. I want to say was that the year the Into History was published? Like I think there may because I think my understanding is like this did cause some ripple in the zeitgeist, though it was not not for its uh, veiled race or semi-veiled racism or its other general obnoxiousness. It's funny, like he is sort of like the weirdly complementary to Robert Sapolsky in that one of his biggest concerns about all this is what Robert Sapolsky thinks everybody's biggest concern will be, which is what will happen when people think that they're not responsible. Like,
Yes.
like what, like
Yes.
what will lose? He even says, like, well, what are people going to stop pulling themselves up by their bootstraps when they stop thinking they have a choice about everything? Like, that's a big, big concern for him, which always seems to me to be a really bizarre, like a really bizarre place to go when confronted with the prospect of not having free will.
Because it's this weird erasure of the individual that these people always go to with glee. It's like once we all admit that human beings aren't fully the masters of their own life trajectory, everyone will give up. And that just doesn't strike me as true.
No, because it
Like
hasn't been true 100 times over when
right with
exactly the same
Protestantism
conclusions
or
have
right
derived from different
exactly.
philosophies and different worldviews throughout history.
Exactly. And whether it is a religious scripture that says you can only be judged by your acts and those acts are predetermined by God, you still see people performing good and bad acts in the same way that
Yeah.
people who decide that
And
God is
hating each
dead.
other and holding people responsible for
Right.
things. And yeah.
Right. And similarly, once you go to atheism and say that there's no higher power, still people are,
Right.
establishing different higher powers or ways to differentiate themselves from their neighbors. And like, so
Right.
it doesn't, it's this odd false conclusion that you're right. So many of these thinkers come to that seems so on its face inaccurate.
Well, and it does seem like there's a, like, so this is where I start to have a little more interest in like what kinds of like the thing that I'm always baffled by in conversations about free will is any sentence beginning or any like essay beginning like, because there is no free will, we should
Yeah.
X.
Yeah.
And to me, like, that's always an absurd statement.
Yeah.
Because if we have no free will, then there is no should. There's only what will happen. The question I am a little bit interested in, and Ted Chiang's story, very briefly, is a sci-fi ramped up version of the Libet experiment, where there's a little toy basically invented that has a, as he calls it, a negative time delay, which is a kind of an elegant way to say, it's a little light and a button, and the light turns on 1 second before you press the button.
And this story is good, by the way. It's called
Yeah, it's a tight little one-page
Expected
story.
of Us. What's Expected of Us by Ted Chiang, Chiang, and it's a little one pager, which is
Yeah,
totally fun
it's
and
very
worth
very
reading.
elegant. Yeah,
If you like the short Borges stuff, you'll like this.
yeah. And the what he does is in a way like it is the converse of the, because philosophy, we now nothing matters. Like what he says basically is like, well, even if everybody kind of already knows there's no such thing as free will, it doesn't really hit home until you see it demonstrated personally to you with your own actions. And that's what this little toy does, is that basically, like, if you play with it for long enough, you start to see that no matter what you do, it will always accurately predict when, like, if and when you're going to press the button. And he, in his world, like 30% of the people who play with that, then, like, by whatever causal chain, they end up basically going into waking comas where they just don't do anything because all meaning is lost. And like,
Right. And he writes, doctors try arguing with the patients. The patients are being people who realize that all free will has been proven non-existent because of this
yeah,
toy, while the patients still respond to conversation, which is a wonderful line because it's indicating that they soon won't respond to conversation anymore. And you have
right,
this
yeah,
moment, this brief moment where doctors are arguing with
there's a
them.
window. Yeah,
We had all been living happy, active lives before they reason, and we hadn't had free will then either. Why should anything change now? Why should anything change now? No action you took last month was any more freely chosen than one you take today, a doctor might say. You can still behave that way now. The patients invariably respond, but now I know. And some of them never say anything again. And
yeah,
that's sort of the heart of the
yeah,
the thought experiment, that
yeah,
once that we can all have these conversations sort of in theory, but once you are forced to contend with the fact that nothing you do is really your choice, you become some percentage of you, but you become a
yeah,
comatose person waiting to die.
yeah, yeah. And so there's, like, to me, like, the question that is a little bit more interesting when it comes to all of this is not like, well, how guilty is the criminal, or like how much should we hate the child molester or whatever, but like the where Wolf gets his title, which is sorry but your soul just died, he gets that from Nietzsche's Parable of the Madman, which of course is like a story about a guy coming to a bunch of well-to-do, educated, hoity-toity liberals, and he says, hey, God is dead. And they all laugh at him because they already know God is dead because nobody takes God seriously. And his response is tellingly like, oh, I've come too soon. You don't realize what it means yet.
Right.
Like, you haven't really digested that there's no God. And Nietzsche has all these predictions about what will happen when people really, really understand that there's
And
no
the
God.
predictions happen to be general enough that most of them come right. Like
Yeah, I mean, they
if
come
you
right, but they also then they're too apocalyptic in some
exactly
ways.
right. Right.
And so here's then like my question.
Also, I don't think you can say that the reason the reason
The reason World War II happened
World
is
War
that
II happened
is
is because
atheism. Yeah,
yeah, it seems yeah.
right. Yeah, and though there are plenty of people who are happy to say like, well, the Nazis were atheists and the Soviets were atheists, and
Totally.
um, but and because Christians never had wars before them, and I do, and I actually do think that there's a live question having to do with like Islam and Judaism and Christianity today. Is that like rather than like all the arguments about like, well, is this religion intrinsically more violent than that one? I think the much more significant factor is that like Islam as a religion, people still take seriously in a way that they don't really with Judaism and Christianity for the most part. Like large societies don't all operate treating Christianity as if it's true, or Judaism as if it's true in quite the same way that they still do more so with Islam.
Right. And when you call people cultists, a lot of times what that means in our society is they just like actually believe in
Sincere
their
believers.
religion,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
that is and those are the people who have the tendency towards more violence. So
Yeah.
I don't fully I haven't fully thought through the implications of what you're saying, but
No, me neither.
it
But
it strikes me as plausible. I think listeners might be thinking right now, but purely secular societies drop bombs on people and murder
oh,
people
totally.
and
Well,
do this
and
all the
I'm
time.
not saying that
So
all of this means that is that like therefore it's bad when people believe Islam. I'm just saying like I think that's one of the differences is that people treat life and death tenets of Islam with a sincerity that they seldom on a large scale do with Christianity and Judaism and even like Hinduism at this point.
I agree with you. I'm just not ready to attach that to a propensity to violence yet, although I could be convinced. But anyway,
Oh
carry
no,
on.
yeah, I mean, and I actually don't like. I don't even mean it in terms of like, and therefore more violence. I just mean like, in terms of the way choices are
Yeah,
made. Because like, what I am interested in is like, okay, I don't think because there's no free will, then we should do this or that or anything. But I do wonder when more people broad like when God, Nietzsche says God is dead, what he means is like people don't take it serious. Like people as a whole broadly don't really think that like
yes.
God is a
It means
serious
sort of society is godless now, is
right.
what he means.
Yeah, and like I'm interested in okay, so when people broadly do or don't believe in something, what effect does that tend to have on them? Like, what effect would it have if, broadly speaking, people generally didn't believe in free will? Like, how might that start to affect people overall? And then, like, this is the
But
same
what's
question.
interesting about
Yeah.
but what's rhetorically dangerous about where you're going is I think the disbelief in free will is more of a belief than people stopping to believe in free will. Like the people who disbelieve in free will, those are the believers in this conversation. Everyone else is just walking around.
Well, so then this is maybe like the conclusion I've started to come to, which is like an old like puzzle for Christian societies is, and sometimes it's framed in one way and sometimes it's framed in another. And I read a religious, I can't remember who it was. It was some religious person making a case about how like we shouldn't get too glib about this one way or the other. But he was actually like criticizing religious people of, from his own perspective. But like a standing question with Christians is like, okay, if your friend died and he was a good person, why are you sad?
Yeah.
Right. And it's an absurd question because, of course, people are sad, but also it is if the belief in heaven is sincere. And granted, like, depending if you're Catholic and whatever, like, heaven may not be the immediate consequence of death. Like, maybe there's purgatory, which isn't so great, for a few, thousands of
Right.
years.
I
But,
think the
like,
answer to that from my perspective is two obvious things. And
yeah,
this is probably bigoted, but like one is that they miss their friend,
yeah,
right? And people are generally selfish, not necessarily even with a negative connotation, but like they are thinking about their own lives more than other people's lives. And it makes me sad that my friend is not here to hang out with anymore. And it reminds me that everything in life is fleeting, et cetera, et cetera. The crueler response, so that's one. Number two
yeah.
is that they don't actually believe in heaven.
Right. So here's then the conclusion I've started to come around to, which is, 150 years after Nietzsche said, like, hey, we all we all read Darwin, but we still haven't really digested that there's no God. We haven't really like come to terms with what that means. I think we still haven't. Like, I still don't see people actually living and thinking and talking with the full ramifications of there not being God in their actions. But I also, in just the same way, see plenty of Christians not quite behaving as if they really believe in the afterlife. And the conclusion I come to is not that like Christians are hypocrites or like people are dumb, but
Yeah.
like maybe the answer to the question, like, what would it be like if everybody like digested this philosophical conclusion? Maybe the real answer is people never digest philosophical conclusions, and like people's actual day-to-day lives
Yeah.
are never really fundamentally colored by like a larger rational like uh set of conclusions about like how about the nature of the world.
And I this is where I start painting with very broad brushes. But I have found that those people who are driven by philosophically consistent beliefs, or not consistent, but philosophical beliefs about the nature of the world and therefore how that should make them live,
That's what we call a fanaticist, right?
are less pleasant to be around.
Oh God, yeah. I mean,
Right.
that's why, for good or ill, whether you agree with them or not, like that's what we think of like Savonarola or Greta Thunberg or
Right.
like
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
like those are people who sincerely are living with the like with a direct line between their larger philosophy and their day-to-day lives, and it's intolerable to be around, even if it's correct, even if like
Right.
same with like Marxist revolutionaries, same with Christian
Same of like
fundamentalists, like
Joan of Arc was fucking unbearable to like have dinner with.
oh God, yeah. I mean,
Like
or jihadist martyrs, or like
right.
yeah, like these are yeah. I think that is like there are some people, but that is the always the outlier, and most people don't really like philosophy doesn't really shape how they live their lives. They're responding to what they see and feel around them, which
Which is
includes like
better, right? Which is
I think there. I mean, I think there are advantages and disadvantages to it. Like I think there are huge blind spots that result from it, and that's partly things like I mean, which is partly the problem with like environmentalism is like it just is really hard to it's really hard to care about in the way
I
that people probably sort of need to, and that and I think similarly, like there is a fundamental self-centeredness, not just selfishness, but self-centeredness that I don't see either atheists or the religious regularly overcoming. That is just the result of having a first person.
but do you see people, thoughtful people in between having that, or just the human beings not have it?
Not have what?
You said that what I thought you said is like virulent atheists and true believing religious folk are in are lacking an understanding of how their beliefs contribute to them being pleasant and helping other people live pleasant lives. Did I misunderstand what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
No. No.
All
No.
right.
No.
So
Like.
restate it.
So I mean, I think like what I'm responding to is you said like, well, it's better in general that we don't actually let our philosophical convictions affect our day-to-day
Yes,
lives.
I believe that. Yes.
And I think that probably what's definitely true is it makes us more pleasant. It makes us more like bearable to be around. I don't know that it's all
If we don't let our
yeah,
beliefs
if
affect
we
the way our
respond
lives.
as
Yeah.
like creatures in the environment we're in, around the people we're around, with like who are sad when like a rock falls on Jim and Jim's not around anymore,
Yep.
and who sort of like are able to have fun at the party despite like knowing sad things about the future, right?
Yes.
Like that
Right.
makes us better to be around. It makes us probably generally happier and more certainly more pleasant and more likable and all these things. I don't know that it is always for the better. I think like there are some ways in which it is worse, but I do think that it is usually the case.
I'll play that out. What ways is it worse?
I think it becomes more of a problem when we live in a larger social unit, right? Like I think it is less of a problem when we live in villages. I think when we live in villages it's probably just right. But when our actions also then have like continent-wide consequences, or like continent-wide policies end up affecting our day-to-day lives, then I think it would sometimes be valuable for us to be able to incorporate a wider perspective into our daily lives. Like,
I'm not convinced. Can you think of a single example?
yeah, I mean, I think like one of the consequences of responding just mostly to your environment, to what's around you immediately, is also like tribalism and prejudice. Like, I think we are less likely to give strangers and foreign entities the benefit of the doubt when we are responding to just what's around us, because when we're responding to just what's around us, we tend to favor those who are close to us, to us, and disfavor others. I think, like,
yeah, I mean, that's a bit of a rhetorical bait and switch, because I don't think I'm arguing that we should be wedded to the comfort levels of those in our immediate presence. I'm just saying that when people are wedded to unyielding bedrock principles,
oh yeah,
that
yeah.
tends to be
No,
worse.
right. No, yeah. So absolute fanaticism, inflexible fanaticism, is a worse model.
But where does
But
inflexible
if that's a
fanaticism?
binary choice, then that's a worse model.
Okay.
But I
Right.
think,
So,
like, there. I mean,
right,
and like
people can
where
be
Sapolsky makes,
be driven by certain values. You're saying,
yeah,
and those,
like where
right?
Sapolsky
Sure,
makes I think a good
sure.
like where he's most compelling is in the middle of some interview. I think it was the interview, not the excerpt, when he says like, okay, what if people just believed in a little less free will? I was like,
Yeah,
okay, all right, well, like,
yeah.
for one, like,
I liked that too. I found that
like, it
charming.
feels like
Yeah,
a weird like defeat, for like a like surrender on his part, but it also seems like reasonable. Like,
yeah.
okay,
It's
well,
the most human
actually,
moment in the art. I
right, like
totally
maybe
agree.
we need to just like adjust our scale. So no, I think you're right. Like, if it's a binary between like provincialism and fanaticism, I'd go with provincialism, definitely. But I do think that, like, as with like Baudelaire says, like, if you want to be a real artist, you need that like intuitive, immersive, trance like love of making and being lost in the moment. But also, like, there's probably a limit to how great your work can be if you don't also have a critical eye. Like, you probably need a little bit of an
Yeah,
ability to like step back and like look at a larger structure and apply a little bit of leverage to your like intuitive beauty making engine. And I think similarly, like, when we're probably at our best, we take our natural provincial selves, but we take advantage of a little bit of that broader philosophical perspective in order to like expand and improve those provincial sensibilities at the edges, at the places where they start to get sour, at the places where they start to bump into other people. That was my conversation with Brian. There is more of our conversation coming up soon on the Secret Show feed. Go to sleerickets.substack.com. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com. Oh, yeah, and I still have a book. It's called Midlife. There's a link in the show notes. Go check it out now. Thank you all for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.